Hello and welcome to Media 7. This week our venue has a special resonance. If the walls of the Classic Comedy Club could talk, they do it in punchlines. And in the month of the New Zealand International Comedy Festival, we're taking a serious look at the laughs and peering across the gulf between a busy performance comedy scene and the broadcast media. We have the producers and the talent to hand, but first Simon Pound sets us up.
You're so beautiful, like a tree or a high-class prostitute. You're so beautiful. You could be a part-time model. You probably still have to keep your normal job.
You can't talk about New Zealand comedy today without Flight of the Conchords. Their mega success has changed the game, according to New Zealand comedy supremo Scott Blanks, owner of the Classic.
The networks, they've come looking for comedians and other performers. They're looking for everything that they might be able to turn into the next Derby, Flight of the Conchords sort of thing. And, you know, because they don't want any more to get away.
Much has been made of TVNZ having missed Flight of the Conchords. But would it have been possible to make it here?
They would have never made anything like that here. And so, in a way, it was a blessing for us all, because what was made was something world-class, culty, cool.
Any news? Jermaine, you got any?
Oh, we've got girlfriends now.
Really? Even both of you?
Yeah, we've met them and everything.
There never appeared to be any executive interference where someone was going, it's good, but it needs a fart gag or a laugh track.
Yeah, between the crew, money, New York setting and freedom they received, it was a special mix. Maybe these comics will be able to tell us just what does it take to make good comedy.
People have got to trust comedians that comics know what's funny.
Allow comics to have more say as to how things are made.
Leave the creative in the hands of the people that wrote it.
Right. Noted. Could we learn anything from how they do it overseas?
Most of the great comedies in Britain have come out of the non-commercial BBC channels, and then a lot of them have been picked up by the commercial channels, and they grow like that.
That's the luxury of the American system. They make hundreds of pilots every year, and you know they might make 100 pilots, and 10 of them might be made into a series, and one of them might get a second series.
I mean, if you look at the BBC, they have such a beautiful model of how comedy's made. You know, comics get radio shows, then they get television shows, and when they get television shows, producers, you know, they're given a budget and then they're left alone. New Zealand has an epic history of just wanting to fuck with shit.
Well, we've learnt something. More comedy attempted, plus more trust, equals less melody rules.
Simon Pound there. Well, joining us now are the people who try and make it work. Comedy Festival Director Kylie Aitchison, Paul Yates, whose TV work includes Facelift and stretches back to pulp comedy and skits in the 1990s, and Dave Armstrong, who is, among other things, the co-creator of 7 Periods with Mr Gormsby. Welcome to you all. Kylie, I can recall a couple of months ago talking with Scott Blanks, and he said that he'd been contacted by the overseas comedy agent saying, is the festival still going to go ahead? What with the recession and all? And he said, well, yeah, we're just ploughing on in the assumption that it will work. Is it working?
It's working amazingly well. We're at the moment we've sold about 95% of tickets that we sold last year, and we've still got 2 weeks to go. So we're thrilled.
How much do you think that works in part because there is comedy on every week? I mean, after our show is recorded every Wednesday night, I'm always astonished at how many young people turn up and pay $10 to come in and watch comedians they've never heard before.
Yeah, I think comedy is really part of the entertainment landscape now. Our audiences are getting really young, the ticket prices are really affordable, so the Classic's been full, I think, pretty much for the last year, which is a great lead into the festival.
So are you also, as Scott suggested there, starting to see the TV commissioners come in? Have they got the whiff of something? Slowly,
yeah. I think we've had a lot more scouts through this year, which is something we really haven't had before. I've had a lot of approaches, a few tele companies coming in, which is really exciting for us, yeah. It's new as well, because we haven't had that in the past.
Well, the other new development, of course, is that we now have Comedy Central airing on Sky, and that's notable because it actually has local elements, only very short ones, but there are short clips of local comedians in performance. Whose idea was that?
That was Hilary Coe. So Hilary was the director of the festival, and she's gone on to launch Comedy Central. So I think her background in the festival and in the live comedy industry sort of really cemented the need for Comedy Central to have a New Zealand focus and a New Zealand feel.
So do you think that's working well in turn for the performance side?
Yeah, our local ticket sales this year have been amazing. Sort of Ben Hurley's sold out, and which has sort of been the first time I think that our locals are competing on the same stage as, and ticket-wise, as the internationals.
Now, Paul, you're the man who was there, and who knows, Flight of the Conchords being supposedly turned down by TVNZ. Can we settle this for history? What happened from your point of view?
From my point of view, basically pitched a good idea, and it must be stressed that the idea that I pitched with Jermaine and Brett was very different to the series they have now. So it wasn't like TVNZ missed the opportunity to make the series that they're making now. We pitched a mockumentary, which was an alternative history of New Zealand music, which sort of inserted Brett and Jermaine at certain points in it. So they were there in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So it was a very different idea. And ultimately, they just, the network that was involved, TVNZ, felt it was just a little too cult and also a little too expensive. There was quite a bit of CG inserting them into archival footage. So unfortunately, they missed the boat. And at the time, the guys were about to be discovered and become huge, and it was frustrating, because I knew that these guys were fantastic and were going to be huge, and you had a network that was sort of going, well, these guys are a little cult, and will the audience like them? And of course, the rest is history. Yeah,
we actually checked with TVNZ and asked them to look at the file. Tony Holden, who you dealt with, is no longer there.
Yep.
They said their reading of it was that Tony Holden really loved the concept. It was called Folk the World,
yep.
But at $300,000 for an hour and a half, they felt it was too expensive, and that NZ on there wouldn't go for it. Does that tally with your experience?
Again, that's one of the problems of getting shows funded in this country, is that you have a funding body who are often quite happy to fund things, whereas you have a network who are using that as an excuse, it has to be said, that things are too expensive. When, you know, TVNZ was saying, oh, too expensive. Whereas I'd had meetings with NZ on Air, the TV managers at the time, saying, we would have loved this. Why aren't the networks supporting it? So, on the one hand, you have a network saying it's too expensive, but the funding body probably would have gone with it.
Do you agree with Scott, though, that it did work out for the best in the end?
Well, in the way, yeah, I was kind of the kiss of death in New Zealand that sent them off overseas. So it was my kind of fault. I had to claim some small responsibility for their success. But yeah, no, if they'd have made the show that they're doing now in New Zealand, it wouldn't have worked, because it's got the context of them being in New York, and they're New Zealanders in New York. That's why it's funny. If you'd have done New Zealanders in New Zealand, clearly that wouldn't have been quite so funny.
Dave, you were the co-creator and co-writer of 7 Periods with Mr. Gormsby, which always seems to me...
that's right.
Yeah, it always seems to me to have stood out because it rated well here, and if anything, went better across the Tasman.
Certainly.
What happened there? Why did that work?
I'm not sure. The first series did very well in Australia and got really good reviews in, you know, big newspapers, and we always felt they got it. And over here we were often called Nazis or racists or all sorts of things, and we thought it was an attack on free market education. And I think, yeah, the reviewers in Aussie, of course I didn't meet people over there who'd seen it much, a few people, but the media seemed to be much more into it. Of course there was a tiny wee show called Summer Heights High that came along very soon afterwards, which means most people in Australia probably haven't heard of Gormsby, but it did do for, you know, especially for a New Zealand show, exporting very well.
Well, was Gormsby specifically seen as a New Zealand show over there, as being New Zealand humour?
What was disturbing to me is they said things like, look, I know it's New Zealand, but it's quite funny. And believe it or not, it's New Zealand, but parts of it are intelligent. They panned the production values, and it was made, you know, relatively cheaply in some ways, but they kept having to say, look, I know it's from New Zealand, but I laughed. And that worried me, because it's like, come on.
What were they expecting? I mean, were they expecting something much broader and not as smart?
I mean, if you have a character that you write in New Zealand that talks about, you know, Dostoevsky or something, they think that you're trying to be anti-intellectual or something. And so I think there's a perception overseas, especially in Australia, that all our comedy is sort of stupid and fart-obsessed and rural. And I must say, I think Conchords have gone an enormous way to stop that. But, you know, even they in their first series got shoved on a late time slot on Channel 10, I think, in Oz. And I think this series will make Australians sort of sit up and take notice of them. But yeah, I think it's a problem that we're sort of the little brother of Australia. So we go over and then they sort of look at this little brother and go, actually, he can be quite intelligent. He can be quite funny at times. So that's sort of my perception of it.
Do you think we maybe lack the courage, Paul, to actually go out with something that is a little bit cryptic and a little bit smart, like like the Concords, or even going back to Fred Dagg, that looked broad but in fact wasn't? Do we kind of underrate ourselves?
I think so. I think courage is one way to look at it. I think commercial sensibility is another way. I think they're often too worried about how many people are going to watch it, when I think comedy's got to be about risk. You have to take risks, because comedy's about surprising people, so you have to go out there. And I think we've tended to be a little too safe, a little too careful, and put all our eggs in one basket. So New Zealand comedies tended to try and appeal to everyone and ended up appealing to no one, sadly.
Whereas, Kylie, I think the performance comedy scene is the complete opposite. Oh. It's a place of amazing diversity. The fact that someone like Philip Paxton can get up there.
And James McKeesay, Samoan comedian. We've got kids doing shows on the festival that are 18 years old and selling out for the first time sort of ever. So we have a really diverse range of shows. We've got theatre and stand-up and sketch, and it is a real melting pot of comedy styles, which doesn't really seem to translate to television, I think.
I think that's the problem with television, just as a genre overall, is that because it's changing, you've got smaller channels and things like C4 that are really changing the way comedy can be pitched, because it used to be this elusive search for a family sitcom or a broad appeal. But actually, sometimes, if you're a Pacific Island comic, you can get that PI audience really laughing at you and then go out and get the broad appeal as well. But there's little niches created, both live, but I think TV is becoming in some ways more niche driven. And so it's good news for comics.
Good news for comics, yeah.
But hopefully they won't try and blend out.
It's interesting that you mentioned C4, because often the comedy there is not presented as a comedy show. It's slipped into other shows, like the download concept stuff in Jono's new show, which we seem to actually do that quite well. If you look at something like Shortland Street, has had some great comic moments over the years. Is that just something we do better? We're better at making serious things funny, or?
I think we're better at comedy when we don't know we're doing it.
Right.
Or when we don't.
I think that's the point I was trying to reach, actually.
If someone comes up to you and says, this better be good because we're spending a lot of money on this, that's the worst thing. That's like, shrivel. But if you're, if you don't really know what you're doing, and you don't know that it's going to be seen by so many thousand or million people, that's a great space to be in.
We do cheap comedy well, because networks tend to leave it alone because they don't have to worry so much. So shows like Jono's new show, or Moon TV, shows like that have been left alone, and they're made relatively cheaply, and they just the key is leaving them alone to do their own stuff.
I heard a great saying: cheap comedy. What is it? Bad comedy. Good comedy is cheap. Bad comedy costs millions. And yeah.
It's also about trusting the comedians, I think, as well. That they stand on stage every night and are funny, and they know their audience. And it seems when that sort of cross over to television, that there's not that same trust.
No.
And the interesting thing about Moon TV, and I suppose you could say this for Wayne Anderson, singer of songs as well, late night mainstream channel TV made for very little actually rates. Moon TV is rating quite well. I understand it's actually rating better than Flight of the Conchords is on Prime, which certainly says something. Yeah. So does that mean that when you go in and pitch an idea, you lowball your budget?
You try to, but you've also got to pay your mortgage. No, it is true. I think because you're making those steps to make things slightly cheaper, I think you make those leaps in terms of comedy. As you say, if things are expensive, you have to spend it on something, and it gets out of hand. Whereas if you're making something small, low budget, it's immediate, and comedians can get their stuff on screen easier, I think, is probably the key.
I think we could learn from BBC on this, though. I heard a great story about Monty Python when they started, and some guy in a suit, an old guy in a suit, said, I believe you fellows are very funny, so here's your room, and write us a series, please. The guy commissioning had no real connection with it, but he just thought, though, he'd heard some good stuff. And there was, very little interference. For sort of culty stuff, the worst thing is to try and appeal to a middle-aged, middle mainstream audience. So, I think sometimes when people create comedy for TV, commission it, they've got to really trust the youth of the performers or the culture of them. Don't
because they know.
Yeah, let them do it.
Well, we'll take a break now, actually, and come back. And when we come back, we'll look at the way things were in New Zealand TV comedy.